in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Loa Boots. Start your day off on the right foot with footwear that was designed for those who stand relentlessly in the face of adversity. I wear Loa every single day, for miles on canine searches and for hours on tactical operations in inclement weather. No matter what, Loa keeps me moving. Whether you run, hike, hunt, or fight, on the streets or out in the woods, Loa has the gear you need to help you conquer whatever challenges you face. Go check out their new line of trail running shoes at Loa Boots, L-O-W-A Boots.com, and get outside for some fresh air and daylight. Loa, for those who know where they're going and won't stop until they get there.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
So, Jim, you've probably heard me say this, but we've got a saying in dog training, right? For the audience who hasn't heard this, that the only thing two dog trainers can agree on is that the third is an idiot.
You know, I use that term all the time, but I use it actually about raising kids.
That's, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, fair. The only thing two parents can agree on.
Exactly.
And I think self-defense and the firearms industry is, I don't know if it's worse. I think dog trainers tend to be a little bit more like neurotic in a lot of ways. But I definitely think that like there is very much a tribal component of the self-defense and the firearms world. And it's a lot like that. And I think there's a lot of private self-defense people and shooting instructors out there. The people that work at and live in gun shops and the competition world and stuff like that. And there's this feeling for a lot of them, that, or at least the perception that I have, is a lot of them feel like they have something to prove because they don't necessarily have some sort of like resume or background, like professionally, outside of, essentially being a hobbyist or enthusiast.
Well, if you don't have one, just make it up. That's what about half the people on the internet do.
Well,
right?
Yeah. And I hate that. I hate that people have to feel like they've got something to prove because they don't have a resume or a background, because you can have good things or bad things to say regardless, right? And that brings me to a lot of like cops and military guys tend to have a chip on their shoulder because they have some sort of background or resume. And they think like, well, I do this for a living and therefore I somehow know what I'm talking about. And the problem is both categories of people in those scenarios have a lot of really stupid things to say, in my experience.
Yeah, I think that was nicely put. And, you can have not much of a resume and a good idea, or you could have a ton of great resume and a stupid idea, and vice versa, right? There's a reason why society likes backgrounds and resumes. The point you make about backgrounds and resumes specifically, I think, is a useful point in this discussion. It gives you some context, right, when you know their background, and it proves that the speaker has, at some point, achieved some sort of standard. But one of the things I like exploring specifically here on Tactical Tangents is where the communities overlap and like where they don't. Like, for example, a Navy SEAL might give great advice, and a lot of them do. But it is usually in the context of doing, Navy SEAL stuff. Balancing a ball on their head and swimming into the water and catching fish.
Volleyball, probably.
Yeah, volleyball. And that doesn't necessarily translate to even conventional military stuff, let alone law enforcement, let alone civilian. They have different environments, different contexts, different assumptions that they have to make. A Navy SEAL, as an example, is usually in great physical shape. They usually have a team with them. They can usually call in air support if things aren't going well, or medevac if things aren't going well. They might have to stay in the field for a prolonged period, or conduct amphibious operations going from like salt water to land over the beach, if you will. That's a lot different from Mike dealing with a deranged meth head in front of a Circle K. And it's a lot different from me dealing with someone breaking into my car in the driveway of my house in, New Mexico or whatever, Texas at 3 a.m. Now, does that mean that you should ignore everything a Navy SEAL tells you? No, of course not, right? They're presumably smart guys and great dudes and have a lot of training, and some of it will be very relevant, but some of it won't. What we want you to be is a critical consumer of the advice you're getting and contextualize it, and also recognize bullshit for bullshit, and also don't be like blinded by putting people on a pedestal, halo effect. Oh, this guy is a SWAT dude. This guy is a Navy SEAL. This guy is an HRT. This guy was in Omega Force. Whatever. A good idea is a good idea. And usually a good idea can be supported with data, experience, training, pressure testing. And that's what we really want you to do by way of this project, is be a critical consumer of the information you're getting.
Yeah, I think the context is a big deal. Like the resume and the importance of someone's background, it helps to know just where they're coming from. If I'm trying to consume a piece of advice and I want to ask the questions, like, well, where are you getting that? Like, explain to me some context there. And, having a background and a resume to impress somebody, that doesn't help me a whole lot, right? To be able to rattle off a bunch of, certificates or events that maybe you attended or something like that, okay, that's fine. But what the experience gets is, has this person seen these things in context? And like what that context is really, really matters. So I think that's a good way of looking at it, and not having that halo effect. It's like, not only do you evaluate and be critical about the information that they're giving you, but also the perspective that they're coming from, or the context that they're giving it to you in. So we're talking about evaluating the advice that you might get from somebody, right? And isn't that a little bit ironic that a couple of dudes who fit pretty neatly into one of those two categories that we talked about are sitting here putting together a podcast to call out all the stupid advice as if we have all the right advice and we have all the answers. Obviously, our answers are better than everyone else's.
Obviously.
Duh. No, of course not. That we recognize and appreciate the irony in putting this together. And it's something that we're trying to be really, really careful in how we craft the message in here, because it's that piece of being critical about it. Like, we want you to challenge us. We want you to question it. We're just trying to get the gears turning. And we want people to hear bullshit called for bullshit so that we want to normalize that. Right. And I could tell you, and I'm sure Jim can tell you, plenty of times where a lot of really smart, really credible guys with the background and with the resumes, all of those people get in a room and they still fight about this stuff. Like, my teammates and I, guys with a ton of experience, guys who are very smart, can still have a very passionate argument or disagreement about the right way to carry a gun, or to clear a room, or to treat a casualty, or whatever.
Or you don't even get to have that conversation because you're in a gun store trying to pick out a gun for the first time, and you hear someone on some side of the gun counter with like great ideas about what you should get or what you should do. And like, whoo boy, like, you don't even get access to people with the good resumes in a lot of cases. So there's bad advice no matter, like I said, on the low resume side of the spectrum and on the high resume side of the spectrum, right?
Well, and when those reasonable minds differ, when I've sat in the room with some very smart, very credible people, and we've had those arguments, at the end of it, it's not like one person wins and one person loses and suddenly we have the right advice or the right tactic. What it boils down to is we've teased out all the nuance and we understand that, like, all right, well, this is one way to look at the problem. This is another way to look at the problem. And the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle, depending on the day or the problem or the scenario, right? In fact, part of where this episode came from, Jim and I have observed a number of very odd pieces of advice given to women in our lives, right? We've seen like female friends and coworkers and stuff who have been told one thing or another. And we actually talked about putting an episode together just about that. But it occurred to me, like, wouldn't it be odd for a couple of dudes who've never had to live in that kind of, like, I've never been a lady, right? At least
as
not
far
that
as we know. It's 2025.
yeah. On the weekend, what I do on my own time is my business. But wouldn't it be weird for us to sit here and spout off all the advice to women without having a woman's voice to speak to what their unique and specific challenges might be? And at the end of it, like, the bigger problem is that there's bad advice all over the place. It's not unique to women getting bad advice, or cops or concealed carry people or Navy SEALs or whatever. We've shared our thoughts and our advice on a lot of topics, and I'm sure we get it wrong sometimes too. And that's part of the point.
Yeah, Mike has a valid point on that, but whether I'm packing boy parts or girl parts this week, I can tell you that wasp spray is a stupid tool for self-defense, right? And if I had a nickel for every time I heard someone suggest that, I would have quite a few nickels stacked up, right? If you need a girl to tell you that wasp spray is stupid, you're missing the point, right? Good advice is good advice, bad advice is bad advice, and a lot of good advice proposed with good intentions from a brother to a sister, or a dad to a daughter, or a boyfriend to a girlfriend, or a boyfriend to a boyfriend, whatever. Bad advice is bad advice.
Or a retired Navy SEAL to a room full of cops.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing, is you have to contextualize it. And women face different challenges than men do in the world, right? That's just, I think that's a fact of life in a lot of cases. I think where we're going with this at the end of the day is that we want you to challenge not only us and the content and the material, right? But we want you to challenge yourself on how you think about these things. Like, when we say it's food for thought, it's to get those wheels turning. We want you thinking about these things. And as we mature and we gain experience, our opinions and our outlook changes. I'm sure there's a lot of things that Jim and I have both said on this show that if we went back and listened to old episodes, like, it's probably evolved. Like, we might feel different on things over time. That's just how it goes. Like, that's the nature of learning, right? Yeah.
Well, and some advice that was maybe really good 20 years ago is just straight outdated now, right? There was a time when a red dot on a weapon was dumb because they just weren't reliable enough. They broke too often. Nowadays, it's kind of silly not to have a red dot, right?
Absolutely. So the attitude that we approach, not just this topic, but every topic that we do, I hope, isn't about a right or a wrong answer, right? The solution to every problem. It's about offering insight and critical thinking. It's about fueling that debate. The debate is healthy. The room full of smart, credible people arguing about things, man, it can get heated and passionate and whatever, but that is so valuable. And honestly, like, in my work on a tactical team, it's honestly what makes the special in special weapons and tactics is some of that debate, right? So we need you to challenge assumptions, and we need you to recognize all the it depends X factors, right? And the decisions that you might make. So the goal in this episode, as it relates to bad advice, boils down to a couple ideas or principles which really should apply just to life in general, like reading the news or anything else for that matter. And to make sure that we're super clear, because we're going to use some examples, this episode is not about whether you should shoot 9mm versus 45, or whether a pistol or a carbine or a shotgun is the ultimate supreme, or a crossbow or something is the ultimate weapon for home defense.
Crossbow.
Yeah. Or like how your grandmother or girlfriend should carry a gun. It's not about that, right? We're going to use those examples just to sort of illustrate the way to think about those things, but it's about assessing the information that you might be given as a novice by a so-called or self-declared expert, or also as a well-intended enthusiast, right? Someone who is learning and on that Dunning-Kruger curve, right? The advice that you might give to a person. Again, the guy behind the counter at any local gun store, I think generally means well. They might be ill-informed or lack experience, just like a lot of cops, just like a lot of military guys.
Or the opposite. They might be super well informed. Like
also true,
you don't know, right? You have to assess.
But my point is, like, their intentions are usually good. I think they really are there to help, right? And so, like, don't lose sight of that. But you want to assess that information, especially if you are the novice in that scenario, right? And you want to make sure that whatever information you're getting, you can turn into something useful and actionable, not just following it because so-and-so said so and they've done such and such, right? But because you've evaluated the material and decided to implement it for whatever reasons. And this is a lot about maintaining that like internal consistency, the opposing idea chains. Like, I think this is a good idea, but these are the reasons it might not be a good idea. And like having that kind of back and forth in your head, right? This also applies professionally. It's not just about self-defense or everyday carry stuff. This is, like I said, SWAT guys do this too. And older SWAT guys give advice to younger SWAT guys and veterans to rookies. And I'm sure it happens in the military and so on, right?
Oh, yeah.
The thing that we have to appreciate and I think capitalize on in a lot of ways is that every one of those people, even the rookies or the novice, right, like probably has something good and valuable to bring to the table. And it's kind of like you get a new SWAT guy, right? And they haven't solved the problems that we've solved, but it is a fresh set of eyes. And they might have an idea that no one thought of before because they haven't been immersed in it for so long. And so let the crazy guy talk. You never know. Like, they have something to bring to the table. Like, be open-minded about that, right? So, yeah, some of the good and valuable things might be examples of what not to do. And some of that misinformation or inexperience can get you in trouble, right? In big trouble in a lot of cases. But the idea here is critical thinking and challenging your own assumptions is being able to recognize all of that. And it's all about being open-minded and curious and inquisitive and asking good questions at the end of the day. So we're going to get into some examples of the sorts of advice that you might have heard or some might have given even. And while you might take something useful out of this discussion, I want you to recognize that that's not the point, right? What we're trying to do, because you're gonna hear probably our opinions on those things and what advice we might give. But what we want to really illustrate and hopefully model a little bit is how we think critically about it and how like we can argue either way in a sense. And hopefully that's going to help shape the way that you think about these problems. I also think it's important to frame these sorts of examples as a quote unquote problem. In other words, if we talk about holsters and concealed carry, we're talking about a specific challenge, right? You're carrying a gun, keeping it readily accessible, reasonably secure, but also probably pretty hidden.
Yeah, you're balancing competing factors, right? And it's always going to be a little bit different between each of them, depending on your specific circumstances.
So that problem, and where we're going with that, right, is it doesn't just have one solution, right? It's not like, oh, this is your answer. It depends on a lot of things, right? The environment that you're carrying in, the climate's going to affect that. Like what I can get away with in Arizona in the summer wearing flip-flops and board shorts and a tank top, right, is going to be very different than someone that lives further north of me who wears mittens and stuff in the snow or whatever they wear, a parka, I don't know. They're going to be able to, it's all different, right? the gun you're carrying, the specific, like not only the make and model gun, but the caliber, the size of it, right? All of those things, again, different things you have to talk about. Your body shape, your body type, there's a whole bunch of personal factors that go into this as it relates to things like comfort, your commitment to not only carrying the gun in the first place, right? Sometimes it's just a matter of like convenience. Also, your commitment to things like training and practice, your assessment of risk. Again, that is a personal thing. And just because you have your own assessment of risk, and I'll be damned if I ever leave the house without a gun, doesn't mean that everyone is always going to see it that same way, right? This is personal stuff. So there aren't one-size-fits-all solutions for these problems. There are good fit solutions for a lot of them, but like most things, it depends.
Yeah, and as we roll through our list of what we would consider kind of examples of bad advice, I want to emphasize how some of these might have a kernel of value in them, right? Some kernel of truth, but they've been telephone gamed or distorted or overgeneralized as far as what they apply to. So advice that is sometimes true in a specific context, but as it is taught across the board is dumb, right? And I always cringe when I hear "it depends" because it is an important answer, but you can never stop there with "it depends," right? What does it depend on? What are the contexts? What is the nuance? And we live in this world that is all about, 25 character tweets or whatever
Little sound bites, reels,
soundbite, a bumper
shorts.
sticker,
Yeah.
too long, didn't read, bluff, bottom line up front. We live in a world like that, right? And I understand that, but understand the limits of communicating like that. It makes us dumb. That's one of the reasons why we do long form podcasts, because this is our chance to get into the what it depends on stuff.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I think, going back to our point about bad advice for women in particular, and especially when we recognize that if you look at the gun industry, and like if I know my audience at all, most of you are dudes. I'm sure there are several ladies who listen, and we appreciate you. Tell your friends, obviously.
Yeah, tell your friends.
But really, like a lot of dudes are the protective big brother or husband or boyfriend or whatever that is again from a good place trying to offer their advice to be helpful. And we forget to filter some of that through the unique problems that a lady might face that are different. And some of that is just like social stuff, right? And when we go back to some of that personal risk, like the clothing that you wear and the being comfortable and all those things, I mean, there's a whole lot that goes into that. And so I think that's the important part of like contextualizing everything and watching out for that telephone game, because I can tell you, I mean, it's early January. We got SHOT Show in just a couple weeks, and I can't wait to see all the stupid stuff at some of the tables at these booths. I mean, stuff that is so passionately marketed as like the solution for women to carry a gun in their purse. There's a lot of reasons it's not like a great idea, and we'll talk about that. But like everyone has this like we pigeonhole the way that a woman should carry a gun as if their challenges are the same as ours. And it's just not, right? Like you have to get past that, right? So yes, it depends, right? But we can't like Jim's saying, we can't stop there in the explanation, but we also can't stop there in the solution and be like, okay, well, I guess this is the only way we can fix that problem. Like, no, let's do better, right? Let's be better than that. So we'll dive into some examples here. And we've got a bunch, and we're going to use some examples to illustrate this, but by no means is this intended to be an everyday carry episode or a comprehensive self-defense, concealed carry episode or home defense, nothing like that. These are just examples. We'll scratch the surface and we'll move on. There is more nuance to these things than we're going to capture here, but we're hoping to just kind of like, model the behaviors. So let's talk about holsters, right? Holsters is an easy, like low-hanging fruit here because we talked a little bit about concealed carry and all the things that can go into that. Comfort, commitment, risk assessment, personal risk assessment. Holsters can be made of a variety of materials. Kydex, which is just plastic, fancy word for plastic, special kind of plastic you can call it. Leather, nylon, maybe some other stuff, right? And there's a balance between like something that is comfortable to wear, easy to wear, and is also safe to wear. And there's some pros and cons, right? So you'll have a sample population of people who will swear by an old school leather maker holster that's been doing it for years, and they've been wearing these holsters for years, and they've never had a problem with those holsters. Now, this is one of the gotchas when you're getting a piece of advice that we have to really watch out for. In the concealed carry universe, where someone can make the claim that they've been carrying this gun in this holster for this many years, it begs the question, how many times have you ever had to use the thing? Right? So it is easy to say that like, this is the answer, right? Is like, this holster is great, right? And that's same for like Kydex and other stuff, but like I'm using leather because there are some issues that come up with leather in particular. One is it can get really soft over time as it wears in, and depending on the stiffness of the leather and the way that it's positioned, you can see little pieces of it that might get stuck in a trigger guard, or that the whole holster itself might collapse if you needed to reholster the gun, right? And so if you had to pull the thing out and then it was time to put it back in, you can run into some problems with like a leather or nylon holsters in real life, in a real confrontation or fight, right?
And this is a good example of how situations have changed, because back in the day, we weren't as good at forming plastic as we are now. We're really, really good at forming plastic now, right? So back in the day, the way you got anything that would fit and form was leather. And leather seems like a good idea, right? It does move. It has a little give to it, which makes it a lot more comfortable to carry. And back in the day, a lot more people carried on either an empty chamber or on a mechanical safety.
This is another great example, yes.
As it happens, most people don't carry that way anymore. They carry off safe, if there even is a safety, and chambered, right? So you can't get away with a little piece of leather pushing in on the trigger, something that maybe someone did get away with in the 70s, 50 years ago. You're not going to get away with now. You're going to put a hole in your leg. Oh, and by the way, an awful lot of people back in the day used to put holes in their leg.
I think that another thing that, again, we're not going to, holsters, fine, got it. Types of materials, that can be a factor, right? Now, I get it. Hard materials like plastic versus leather, like digging into your hip or your, abdomen somewhere, sure. There might be a comfort factor there. But remember, you got to balance comfort with safety, right? And if you're willing to take extra risk, right, that's a personal choice, but weigh for it. Related to the holster thing is also the position that you might carry in, right? You'll hear people tout things like appendix carry, strong side carry. You might hear that like 4 o'clock, like just strong side, but just behind, a little bit to the back. Ankle carry, small of back. Some pocket guns out there, shoulder holsters, and then you go down the realm of things like purses, fanny packs, bags, the backpack with the really sweet like sleeve, like that's somehow hidden somewhere you can slide your hand into. That's some sort of holster. And if you want
it, someone's going to sell it to you, right? Those are all on the market because someone wants to buy them. That doesn't mean that they're good ideas.
Yeah, and the thing is like, it's really easy to be a hater, right? If you're, I happen to be of the appendix carry, Kydex holster camp, keep it on your body, etc., right? But I also recognize that there are situations where like, hey, you're going to the gym or something, or you work in an environment where you're going to have to take it on and off a bunch. We talked about climate. If you have jackets and other layers of clothing that are going to be coming on and off a lot, that also affects just accessibility. Like it might be a lot harder to draw through like a trench coat, right? I mean, so there's 1,000 things that all make a difference. And so like you really need to look at all of your options and say, what position or method of carry is going to be best for me? It just so happens, best for me, off-duty, concealed carry, I like the Appendix Kydex holster situation, right? In my analysis of my options, that worked out for me. I will tell you that I was always really critical of ankle carry because it would be so hard to get to in a fight. And then Cecil Birch came on the podcast, who he has a training company that he's done. You should go check out that episode. But immediate action combatives, he does a lot of, not only is he a black belt in jiu-jitsu and he teaches at his place, but he's also doing some integrated, he's part of that like ShivWorks collective group with Craig Douglas and them. And he talks a lot about certain grappling positions where getting to the ankle is actually a lot easier. Now it assumes that you know what you're doing on the ground, right? Like in that grappling context, like he does. But for him in that context, like what a great point. He knows that he can probably get to that kind of positioning based on his skill and his environment, right? So all of those things matter, and those all have to be sort of evaluated. I think another big part of this that there's a lot of folklore about is whether or not it matters if anyone sees the gun.
Yeah. And context matters for that. It's a huge deal, right? So if Mike is an off-duty cop and he's walking around and someone can tell he has a gun, is it the end of the world? Exactly. Most of the time, no, right? Because he's a cop. He's lawfully good to go carrying it. He might draw attention he doesn't want. Someone who means him harm might change their approach because they know he's armed. That's the risk he's now accepting that way. And generally speaking, his risk is going to be lower if nobody knows he's armed, right? If I'm walking around with a gun and I don't have a badge sitting next to it, that's going to draw attention I don't want, and potentially law enforcement attention that, you know, I might be lawfully able to carry, but now I'm having an interaction with law enforcement that I was not seeking, right?
Not only wasn't seeking, but there is still now there's a gun in the equation.
Yeah,
which just
and that has gone badly enough times in history that's not what I want, right?
Yeah.
And a bad guy now knows that I'm armed and knows that I'm the one he wants to shoot first, or he's going to change his approach in a way that puts me at a disadvantage, right? So generally speaking, I want to hide more than I want to not hide.
Well, there's also, you could be a legal concealed carrier who works at a private business that doesn't want you carrying guns at their facility. And it might not be illegal to carry there, and you might take the risk of losing your job or getting in some sort of trouble professionally, right? Maybe not against the law, but also not favorable to your future, right? Again, you make your own decisions. I'm not telling you whether you should or shouldn't in a scenario like that. I'm just saying there is a difference between what your boss might be okay with and what is legal or not, right?
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that people say when they kind of go into that argument, printing, it doesn't matter if you're printing, no one's really paying attention. What they're trying to explain is, for the most part, people are pretty oblivious to the things around them, right?
Usually, yes, but not always.
Exactly,
right?
And that's the problem, right? And so a lot of times, if you were to look at, especially if you're concealed carry, you probably look more than your average person out there, right? And you look at someone's waistline and you see a little bit of something, you know, some bumps or angles or something, and it could just be the top of their belt or a belt buckle or a belt loop, or it could be, I don't know, 1,000 other things that have a completely benign explanation, right? Or it could be a pistol. And the problem with that is, again, even though people might generally be oblivious, sometimes they're not.
Yeah. And the ones that matter to me probably aren't, right?
Right. So I think it's fair to acknowledge that most people are probably not paying attention, but it doesn't make it like, again, it's a personal choice, personal risk assessment. And I think that's what you have to be careful about. What about some less lethal stuff? Jim, you mentioned bear spray earlier.
Oh, bear spray, wasp spray. What I want you to carry is human spray. So this
If
is
only they made such a thing.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that sounds good. Oh, use bear spray because it's for bears, so it'll definitely work on humans. And will bear spray work on humans? Yes, it will. But fun fact, I actually sat down with some of the manufacturers of the spray at SHOT Show, and I said, what's the difference between the bear spray you sell and the human spray you sell? And they're like, Jim, yeah, you're not going to believe this. We had to dumb down the bear spray in order to get permission to test it on bears order to get it called bear spray. And I was like, huh? And they're like, well, yeah, animal testing rules and EPA rules and stuff. So people, I think, get this idea in their head like, oh yeah, bear spray, that'll do it. Or wasp spray. Well, it can spray a long way and you definitely don't want to get it on you. Both bear spray and wasp spray, terrible gosh darn advice. Don't do it. One of the big reasons is they're big cans. So how many people do you know walk around with a big old can of whatever, even if it worked, which it doesn't, in the case of wasp spray. Really, have you ever met anyone who actually follows that advice? Ever? No. 1, because it's stupid. 2, because it's huge. Right? So carry human spray, carry it in a can that you can actually carry around with you. It doesn't do you any good on your nightstand if you're in a Walmart parking lot. Right? So even if I agreed with wasp spray, it's still stupid. Bear spray, same idea. Even if I agreed with it, which I don't, I recommend carrying a smaller can, one that you're actually going to have in your hand and not in a purse and not back in your car and not on your nightstand. That was the whole point of this whole episode, was how much I hate bear spray and wasp spray.
That was literally.
Oh my gosh.
So when we start these like outlines for this, it starts as like a Google Doc with like just a few words of like, hey, this is kind of like a general idea, and let's see where we go with it. That was pretty much it.
Yeah. So other less lethal stuff. It's not a secret when we consider the difference between men and women that women tend to be at a physical disadvantage if they're in some sort of altercation with a man, and the aggressor is almost always a man, right? And so we're always looking for ways to help them kind of level the playing field. And if I had a nickel for every time I've heard someone tell women to put car keys in between their fingers so they can do the Wolverine scratch 'em, punch 'em thing. And that is seriously taught at college campuses all around the country. I've seen it taught by police officers to women at women's self-defense classes. I've seen it taught in martial arts classes, and it is terrible advice. Let's think about why it's terrible advice. 1, it doesn't work. Let's understand why. Why doesn't it work?
I mean, I could think of a couple of reasons. First of all, I think, and this applies to things like pepper spray and stuff as well, right? Which is the threshold might be lower than like pulling out a gun and using it, but there is still you're still in like this social situation, right? There's some social intelligence where like you got to be willing to go, like you're going to go to hands.
Yeah. So
whether you have the keys in your fingers or not, like you're still talking about like going to blows with somebody. And the problem is where a lot of these sorts of like attacks or confrontations are going to happen, there's like an initiative problem, right? Like someone is starting that fight.
Yeah. So the keys have to already be in your fingers, I think is issue 1, right?
Well,
so are you walking around always Wolverine style. And some people I'm sure do. I'm sure like some people walk into the shopping mall parking lot and they're like, ooh, I better get my keys in my fingers.
I think we're kind of where I was going with that was whether the keys are in your fingers or not, you're still in basically a fist fight now, right? Like, I mean, it's already gone sideways.
Yeah. 2, try punching someone like that sometime. Just try punching like a bag of rice.
Yeah.
Just explore the space on that.
Explore the space.
Or try scratching at a bag of rice. Just tell me how it goes. We'll use bag of rice as a model. You could use a ham. That would be fine. But just something that gives you some sort of feedback, right?
Yeah, it turns out punching people to begin with can hurt a fair amount. And so, putting hard objects in and around your hand doesn't exactly simplify the problem.
Yeah, tasers and stun guns also in the less lethal family. There are conditions where, like law enforcement, where it makes sense when they have to handle somebody who like doesn't want to get out of a car or is trying to put up some resistance to them. But generally speaking, one of the issues with taser is most of the commercially available tasers, you get one shot. And most of my cop buddies will tell you that, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. 60% of the time it works every time. So if you're going to go through the trouble of carrying a taser around with you all the time, you're maybe better off carrying pepper spray where you get maybe more than one shot or a gun, right?
Well, and there's a whole other host of issues. So the civilian models of the taser itself, right, has like they've got different duration. I think it's like 30 seconds or a minute, whatever, which is great if it works to give you some time to create some distance, right? But the other thing that the newest law enforcement tasers, the one that we carry now at my agency, it's no longer a 2-probe cartridge and you're hoping that both probes connect. Now it's got 10 probes and they fire one at a time and you have to connect at least twice to make it work. And I haven't seen it used yet in real life personally to find out how much better that works or not. I think the data is not there yet, at least from my experience. I'm sure the data is out there. I just have not experienced it yet. But it's a lot more that gives you several more opportunities to get that thing to work for you than I think what the civilian self-defense ones get, right? You get 2 probes and you got to hope they both connect or it's just not going to do you any good. And I think the issue is if you're reaching a threshold of using something like that, the stakes are too high to take a chance.
I like that.
And that's the issue that I think when I go back to the threshold of like, well, yeah, but now you're in a fist fight, whether you use the keys or not. It's similar with the pepper spray. You're still running and don't get me wrong, I absolutely advocate for pepper spray. We worked with Palm as one of our sponsors, and I have gifted Palm units to friends, not just female friends, to friends in general. I'm a big fan of pepper spray for like off-duty and concealed carry use, and I maintain that it's probably an underused tool in law enforcement. I think there's an emotional avoidance among cops, and I'm not sure that is not well-founded for the record.
Yeah, so pepper spray is a to whom it may concern experience, and that's a thing you need to know if you're going to carry pepper spray, carry pepper spray. Okay, cool. Just so you know, you're probably going to catch a face full of it while you do it, okay?
Well, but I think that's even, honestly, I think that itself is oversold a little bit.
Yeah, having personally experienced that, I will tell you.
Where cops experience it is because now I still have to fight the guy, right? Like I still have to go hands-on with them. But if my intent is to spray the guy and run, a little bit I'm not saying you're not going to get a little bit, but it might not be as bad. I think it's oversold. It also depends on the type of spray that you're using, for the record. But where I'm going with it, though, is carrying it is one thing. There's still some social intelligence that comes with the situations where you've got to reach that threshold of it's in my hand and ready to use. And then the threshold of like, now I'm gonna take initiative and spray this person in the face before they can carry out their next act, whatever that might be. Right?
Yeah, and big picture, like there's a wide spectrum between harsh words and a gun, right? And we've talked about that in previous episodes. And there is validity in having some option, something that you can do to help level your odds, especially if you're smaller stature, right? Pepper spray has value in that. Bear spray does not. Wasp spray does not. Car keys in your fingers do not. Little like self-defense sticks that go on your keychain do not. Tasers and stun guns do not. But what really helps you is getting some training, because in this spectrum, you're going to be touching the other person, probably. And that's where hand-to-hand combat skills, whatever you want to call them, martial arts skills of some form, in addition to confrontation talking skills, right? You're going to need that. And we'll get into that as we go.
And before we do, to build on that a little bit, because I think this is probably one of the more important points in the episode as it relates to advice. Actually, 2 points in here that I want to capitalize on. One is a lot of the last handful of things that we've talked, actually, most of the things that we've talked about in all of this so far, in terms of things that people give advice about, are hardware solutions.
Yep.
They're not software solutions, right? So it's been a while since we've recapped on the people, ideas, hardware philosophy here at Tactical Tangents.
It's on our logo. It's a big deal.
But John Boyd, guy that wrote the OODA Loop and a number of other things, talks about this philosophy, right? Machines don't fight wars, people do, and they use their minds, teach them to think. So he used to emphasize people, ideas, and hardware in that order. So when we say get training, what we're trying to emphasize is there is a human element to problems like this. And when I say problems like this, I'm referring to like confrontation, conflict, self-defense type scenarios, right? There is a human element. This is an interaction between two humans. There are human factors at play: decision-making, situational awareness, self-awareness, social intelligence, emotional intelligence. All of those things play into the outcome, right? And what choices we make. And then there are the ideas, which is arguably you can kind of encapsulate a lot of that with tactics and training, or the reasons that you carry the things that you carry, which leads you into the equipment piece. And when we say people, ideas, hardware, and we say really what you need is to get training, what we're trying to say is that self-defense is not a pepper spray can or wasp spray or any of these things, right? That there's a human element to this. And that human element to this, in terms of problem solving and getting good advice and recognizing all the it depends stuff, is to say like, okay, well, I think this pepper spray might be a good idea, or the taser might be a good idea. Why do I think so? Let's challenge that. Let's look at what that means. Putting keys between my fingers seems like a good idea at the time. Well, why does that seem like a good idea? It still assumes that I have to be in a situation where I'm trying to punch someone in the face who might be bigger, stronger, and more skilled than me, and have the element of surprise and initiative in a dark alley and with a different moral compass than I have. That's the human shit that we need to figure out first. And the solution to that problem doesn't rest in whether or not you should put your keys in your fingers to hit somebody, right? So we need to do it the other way around. When we say, what advice do you have for someone who wants to be good at self-defense? Well, there are some tools that can be helpful, but then we say, get training. Now here's the point, the second point that I want to make on that, which is a lot of people say that. Well, what you really need is to get training.
Thanks. That's helpful.
And don't you worry, because for every schmuck out there trying to sell you some piece of shit self-defense tool, there's 100 others who want to train you about those self-defense tools. And don't worry, they're experts too. So So just saying get training, quote unquote, isn't super helpful because there's a lot of to a novice who doesn't know any better, what you're telling them to do is to just like Google it or go to their local gun shop or karate studio and just like wing it. Like there's a lot of garbage out there, just like all the tools, right? There's a lot of garbage training, and like we got to do a better job of really making sure that we understand like what you're trying to get them to do, right? So, you have to challenge the assumptions as far as training goes as well, and the tactics and the ideas, right? Like Jim mentioned, we talked about the hand-to-hand stuff, and I want to come back to that. But I want to jump ahead to the social skills piece just a little bit. Because I mentioned that threshold where like you're going to choose to use your taser, or you're going to choose to spray someone in the face with pepper spray, or choose to pull a gun out for that matter, right? There's a social situation interaction there. And I'm not sure that this fits into the sort of advice, like the category of the advice that a so-called expert would give to people that needs to be carefully evaluated. I mean, it kind of is. And it's not that people give bad advice in what I'm going to describe here. It's that they model this sort of thing poorly, or they demonstrate poor leadership to people who might trust them. So where I'm going with this is I see a lot of the like self-defense, like the pro Second Amendment, EDC 3%er sheepdog type people, right? That have this sort of attitude about them. And part of that attitude is what puts them in situations where they're giving the advice to other people, right? And this isn't advice that they give. It's a way that they carry themselves that I think we need to be careful about. When I talk about the social skills stuff, they've got this attitude about them, and it's not always bad, but it's this mentality that they will refuse to be a victim. And although that can be useful and empowering in a way, it falls short because they can be a little bristly about how badass they are, right? Or at least how badass they think they are, right? Like, ain't no one going to come take my guns, or, no one's going to carjack, no one's going to rob me. Like, cool, that's fine. But because they know, there's this attitude about people like that sometimes, that because they know they've got a pistol on their person, just as an example, that gives them some permission in their minds to act like an asshole, right? And they might be in a scenario where some guy starts talking shit, right, in a parking lot, or they get mouthy with them in some situation, or, road rage might be a good example, right? And they are more willing to engage in that conflict than maybe they ought to be. Or even if they're not trying to engage in like the fight or the conflict, just because of what they've chosen to put their time and energy and attention into, right? Probably 9mm versus 45 debates, and carbines versus shotguns for home defense, and a bunch of other stupid stuff, right? They've put so much time and attention into learning about that. What they have not done is focused on things like good communication skills and the social tact and awareness to diffuse or de-escalate a conflict. And I think, again, that might not be, now those are the people that are often giving advice. And although that's not advice that they're giving, it is the sort of behavior that they sometimes model that I think we have to watch out for.
So once you have the social skills, and those are important in the talking skills and the risk management skills and the situation awareness skills, at some point you actually do need to develop some hands skills. And there's plenty of bad advice just in that realm, but like take a class, take some kind of class. And there's strong feelings about jiu-jitsu versus Krav Maga versus boxing, wrestling. My thing is, I don't care what you take. I want you to take something. Ideally, I like jujitsu. I like Craig Douglas's ShivWorks ECQC program. We did a couple episodes about it. I think it's very seriously worth looking at. What I like about it is how integrated it is between talking skills, hands skills, and shooting skills, and getting people to recognize that spectrum in between.
Well, and I think when it comes to evaluating advice on the self-defense training that's out there and available, especially because there is some variance in terms of like what people think is the quote unquote best. One of the big things that being a defensive tactics instructor out at the police academy has taught me, and again, this is an important thing to like make sure that we're capturing well here, because we can sit here and say like we really like jujitsu in terms, or we really like, whatever, in terms of advice that we would give. As a police trainer who teaches arrest and control tactics to police officers and police recruits, one thing I can tell you is I don't know shit. Like, I am the lowest level of white belts. The little bit of jiu-jitsu experience I have, it doesn't count for much. The training to become a quote-unquote instructor, not much. And I've seen a lot of people who be like, I taught police officers how to fight for 20 years. It's like, well, I've technically done that for a little bit of time now. And I'm here to tell you it's not something that I would go out of my way to necessarily brag about. But the one piece of insight I will offer, I'm not going to call it advice per se, is to have some frame of reference. I've seen a lot of recruits come into the police academy and they've never been punched before. They've never been punched in the face. And it's amazing. Early on in the academy, we do a couple fighting like survival type drills where, I call them kids, and they're not kids. These are grown ass adults who are going to be police officers in a few weeks, right? But these guys and gals are coming into the police academy. They've never been in a fight before. They've never been punched. And like, that's probably going to happen to them out in the field. So we really need to like break the ice on that. Right?
Just day one of the police academy, thwack.
It's like day 3. Yeah. It's like day 3, and they're fighting each other, right?
It's good.
They're fighting each other, but it's an important inoculation piece for real. And so like, if I'm sitting here trying to give you some sort of quote unquote fighting self-defense hand-to-hand advice, as an instructor who I've done that for a long time, and I'm telling you, like, it's not much to brag about in terms of any skill on my part by any stretch. But when we talk about getting something, have a frame of reference, go do one of these things so that you at least have a starting point. I don't care if it's jujitsu or boxing or Krav Maga or whatever, but like, go put yourself in a situation where you know what it's like to be in a fight. Whatever that is. I don't care what it is. Sparring at a karate studio is better than nothing. But the point is, feel that, if nothing else.
And what I don't like, and kind of going back to the original theme of just bad advice, what I really don't like is just kick them in the balls.
Yeah.
And how many times have people been told that?
Gouge his eyes out.
That's your plan. That's your plan, is kick them in the balls. You don't think any guy on earth doesn't know you're going for the balls?
Yeah.
Every guy on earth knows that.
This is actually a good point. This is a good point. So like, okay, yeah, kick him in the balls is a good one. Gouge his eyes out, right?
Oh, yeah.
Similarly, anything involving carrying knives for self-defense.
Yep.
Now, I want you to think like, and this all goes back to People Ideas Hardware. Like, what I'm telling you is like, if you're asking Mike in 2025 what he thinks you should do for self-defense training, jiu-jitsu and Craig Douglas's curriculum or Cecil Birch's curriculum, that's the place to start, in my opinion. Now,
until you really know what you're doing, start there, right?
And I'm here to tell you, you should question everything I just said, because I might not know what the fuck I'm talking about. That being said, People Ideas Hardware, right? What I'm emphasizing is I want you to be in a scenario where you've been in a fight before, so you know what that feels like. That is a human factors thing. It doesn't matter what method or what practice you're in, right? If you've gone and you've experienced what it's like to be in a fight and what that does to your physiology. whether you feel scared, whether you panic, whether you have the capacity to like harness whatever rage like in your soul comes from maybe getting kicked in the balls or whatever.
Or if you have the conditioning, because it turns out fighting is really fucking exhausting.
Well, and one of the things I was going to say, like when we talk about like gouging his eyes out or using any form of knives for self-defense, is like there is a very emotional component to getting in a fight, right? To being willing to get punched in the face and not just like go fetal position and, you know, get your ass kicked, right? And also the capacity to deliver violence. And a lot of people don't necessarily have the heart to pull out a gun and shoot someone in the face. But if you think that person is going to like gouge out someone's eyes, do you know how like intimately violent that is?
Raw.
And at what point in someone's like survival mentality, if they have never been in a fight where they would have to be to gouge someone's eyes out? Like that's not as simple as it sounds. Like that's stupid advice. Obviously, that's like you're missing so many steps. like to think that someone is going to gouge out someone's eyes with their fingernail. Like, holy shit. Like, doesn't that make you, as a guy who's not a stranger to violence, like that makes me cringe a little bit to really think about, right? Like, so like people ideas hardware, right? This is the human factor stuff. Like, I don't care where you learn how to fight, but like have the capacity to get in a fight first, right? And that goes back to like the willingness to use like pepper spray or taser or whatever too. So I touched on knives in there and whether I think that's a great idea, which not so much, but again, consider how much different it is to like slash or stab somebody, right? Versus like some of the other options available. And Jim touched on this conditioning as it relates to getting in a fight. What about like straight up running? Like be able to run away.
Don't skip cardio. It's a rule. It's a good rule.
Like be able to just run away. Like that might be the best option. Now, I have interacted with people over the years who are like super passionate about never leaving the house without a gun, right? They're like, won't be caught dead at a Walmart without my pistol, right? And to be honest with you, like lifestyle choices, physical fitness choices, like you won't have to worry about it for very long because heart disease is going to get you long before, you know, probably those sort of scenarios are going to get you. So that's part of that risk assessment. We've talked about that sort of thing in the past. But that being said, carrying a pistol is a good, like, it is the, what's the quote, Jim? What does Colt say? The ultimate equalizer? Is that
God made man, Colonel Colt made him equal.
Yeah, right. It does equalize the playing field. It levels the playing field in a sense, right? So if you are, you know, not of great health, and you've got a pistol there, that's helpful. Running away might not be an option if, say, you're traveling about with young kids, because they're probably not going to be able to keep up, and you might have to stand your ground. But there is something to be said about physical fitness and conditioning as well. So again, people ideas hardware. When someone comes to you and they're like, hey, I want to be prepared for self-defense, what should I do? If your answer starts with, go to the store and buy this piece of equipment, right? You probably need to ask more questions. That's what I would tell you about all of that stuff. We've talked about like the social settings, and I've told you how like you get these like bristly concealed carry self-defense types that kind of have like a, you know, Billy Badass kind of attitude. They think they're real tough and cool. And really what you see a lot is posturing. And I think from a social standpoint, people ideas hardware, I have a few like angles on this. right? One is to recognize in a potential conflict or self-defense setting when someone is just bucking up, right? When it's a pissing match or ego thing versus someone is in danger. There's a big difference between someone trying to intimidate versus pre-attack indicators to an imminent attack, right? There is a difference, but that you can cross that bridge in a real short amount of time, right? And so there are times, Jim mentioned this in a recent episode, a Craig Douglas-ism, right? Big difference between stay the fuck back and get back, motherfucker, right? There's this social side of all of that. And what I really think in terms of self-defense tools is important is to recognize that there is a time and a place to be bristly. You just need to be like thoughtful and kind of clinical about it, emotionally detached. It is one thing to confront, right, and face conflict a little bit, but that requires a lot of like social and emotional intelligence, I think. And you know where you see this a lot is like road rage. We did a whole episode. One of our earliest episodes was on road rage. I want to say it was like, I don't know, episode 6 or something. Like it was
an early one. Yeah.
It was like early on. But one of the things that I mentioned in there is like, it's really easy to feel safe in like your metal box. And when you have people in their metal boxes, they don't see each other as human, right? And so it's super easy to like want to fight, right? All right, yeah, motherfucker, like, honk, honk, finger, like, right?
Yeah, so like in place of bad advice, good advice is like, don't go looking for fights.
Yeah.
Just don't.
And
right?
Keep your cool, right? Yeah. Like chill the fuck out.
And like when I look at my list of the advice ecosystem, an awful lot of the advice is like gouge his eyes out, kick him in the balls. And I like to hear just at least as often like be a good human, relax a little bit, build some space, let the police handle your violence for you. That's what you're paying them for, right?
People, ideas, hardware.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
So speaking of hardware, what about guns? Is there any like bad gun advice?
Yeah, we
do. Gun itself?
We do have to hit that because we talked about holsters. We talked about some less lethal stuff. The social stuff, like we nerd out on that because people, ideas, hardware, or at least I do. Yeah. I can't speak for Jim on that. The self-defense,
I don't have social skills.
Stuff.
I'm a pilot.
But most of the people listening to this have heard bad advice on gun stuff, and we want to help you evaluate that because, I mean, and holsters is a big one as well. How and where you carry the gun is a very, very important decision. But again, man, people get so passionate about the gun itself, and cops are super guilty of this, right? A few years ago, my agency switched from Glock to Smith & Wesson. And on some level, like I was guilty of this only to the extent that I said, like, seems like a solution without a problem. Like, what's wrong with my Glock? Like, my Glock has always been good to me. Like, I don't really need to fix it. But man, some people got super fired up about this change. And my attitude at the time was just like, whatever they give me, I'll shoot well, right? Like I'm going to learn how to shoot well, whatever they give me. I don't care. And it turns out I really like the Smith and I shoot it really well, actually. Like I will definitely buy that gun back if they let me whenever they give me a new one. So this goes to that open-mindedness stuff. Hardware choices matter. One of the reasons that we switched from Glock to Smith & Wesson was it was a little bit more accommodating to people with smaller hands. And if you didn't have small hands, then it didn't really affect you a whole lot. But even if you have larger hands, the Smith is fine. The point is, the hardware choices do matter. And there are people who will run into problems when it comes to hardware selection, and they're going to ask for advice. So let's talk about some gun stuff.
So, thing one, here in the 2020s, most major gun models by most major gun manufacturers are plenty good and can easily outshoot 95+%, maybe 99+% of the shooting population. That's it. That's neither good advice nor bad advice. It just is. It's just a fact.
Also,
right?
most of the like people getting killed by guns are getting killed with like some rusty, like broke ass piece of trash that's not been well maintained, and it doesn't. I mean, with ball ammunition. I mean, the point is like plenty of people getting whacked with inferior stuff.
Yeah.
And it's one of the big lessons when we talk about the Boyd thing, People Ideas Hardware, is that he would illustrate to people that ill-equipped forces throughout history
have done okay
against their well-funded, well-resourced, larger militaries, right? Yep. Like it's the essence of like guerrilla warfare. The Revolutionary War was an example of that. A bunch of farmers with muskets and pitchforks like took on the British crown, and here we are, right?
Yeah. So the bad advice as it relates to gun models is like you have to get this specific make model or everything else is garbage.
That's a red flag.
It just isn't, right? Or you have to get a really fancy gun because everything else is garbage. You don't want to get that trash. The absence of good advice is sometimes a problem, right? Like most guns don't get shot very much, so a used gun is often every bit as good as a new gun. The absence of that advice is a problem, right? So especially with a beginner, don't get wrapped around like the enemy of good enough is perfect. Well, if I can't buy the perfect make and model, I don't want to do it at all. Like, just get shooting. Just get going. We do a lot of gatekeeping in the gun community. Well, you got to get, I get asked a lot, what kind of AR-15 should I buy? It's like, I don't give a shit. Go to the store, buy an AR-15, get whatever looks cool.
And shoot it a whole bunch. And if you have a problem,
fix it.
Then deal with that. Right.
Yeah. The AR-15 is the Barbie of guns. If a piece of it breaks, put a fresh piece on.
Well, and largely when you talk about like Jim's point about handgun manufacturers in the 2020s, right? Yeah. Glock versus Smith & Wesson is like Toyota Camry versus Honda Accord.
Exactly.
They're both going to last, and they're both going to work. It's going to be fine.
And if something breaks, send it back to the factory, right? Like, get it fixed.
Well, and shoot it enough to know.
Yeah.
Like, that's the other thing.
Yeah. And get shooting. Get going, right? One common poorly given piece of advice is that weapon-mounted lights are mandatory. This is, in my opinion, it's good advice taken out of context. I personally think, and I have written on our website, that if you have a gun that you intend for home defense that lives in your home for the purpose of being by your bed or by your coffee table or whatever, that gun probably should have a light on it because I want you to identify friend from foe. I think that's important. However, a concealed carry gun that you're going to carry out into the environment, I don't think you need a weapon mounted light on. So it's one of those, like, it has an asterisk. It has a context to it.
Well, speaking of, and there's another argument for the weapon mounted light thing, right? Target identification, largely what it's for, right?
Yeah.
But you also have to consider that if you are using a weapon mounted light to identify friend from foe, you are pointing a gun at something you are not sure is a friend or a foe. Right now, there's, again, nuance in that. Most of the lights these days are bright enough that you can still have it at like a low ready, and it will cast enough ambient light to still give you that picture. And you don't have to point the gun at them to be able to see, right?
Yeah.
But you get where I'm going, right? You have to be careful with stuff like that. This is the nuance in that advice, is I want to know friend from foe. Well, does that mean you're going to point that thing directly at somebody? Or are you going to carefully bounce it, off of the floor and make sure there's enough light to be able to see. Yeah. Because what you tell someone that doesn't know any better matters in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Like if all you tell them is, I want to know friend from foe, they're going to use the light to identify friend from foe. And you probably shouldn't be pointing a gun at someone unless you know you have some justification to do so.
And the reciprocal is also bad advice, that you should never have a light on your gun because the bad guy can see the light and will shoot you.
Right.
That's also bad advice, right? The notion that you always have to have the light separate from the gun is dumb. 1, turn off the light, or 2, turn on the lights in your house, or 3, if you're gonna carry a separate flashlight from the gun and you're gonna practice doing one thing in one hand and one thing in the other hand, I want you to practice that. And my experience doing a very complex thing with my hands for a living is it's really hard sometimes to do smart things with both hands.
Yeah.
Another line that I hear a lot is, well, brand X, whatever brand, is garbage. Oh, no, don't buy a Taurus, it's garbage. Don't buy a High Point, that's garbage. Fine, but like, honestly, if someone's just trying to get into the sport, if someone's just trying to get into shooting, get into self-defense, like, get what you can afford. As a default, I like you can't go wrong with a Glock. I think that's a reasonable thing to say, but to say that anything that isn't a Glock is garbage is dumb. Let's not do that.
Yeah, and I also, it's funny, Glock is, I don't know. I mentioned this, like, gun industry people are just kind of funny, right?
Yeah.
There are people who are just like, Glock is the answer, Glock is the way. And then like people spend a lot of money and do a lot of things to modify Glock. Like Glock perfection. I don't know about that, right? But you have an also really like large population of people that are just like hardcore Glock haters. Like absolutely like, oh, piece of shit. Like they just, and I'm like how does that, how do you justify that? Like, I mean, So all of SOCOM is wrong. All of the CIA is wrong. Yeah. Like half the law enforcement agencies in America are wrong. Half the law enforcement and military organizations of Europe are wrong. The Glock has seen more craniums than a brain surgeon, right? Like, and in fairness, like most of those, I would assess or assume, presume, or hypothesize, right? I don't know for sure, but I would probably argue that most of those are basically stock outside of like the sites. Yeah. Right.
But we now have a very large body of data about the performance of that particular make, right? We have a very large body of data on SIG. We have a very large body of data on Smith & Wesson.
Yeah.
All the major manufacturers, and that kind of goes back to the original point about the gun makers, right? Next one that comes up a lot is, well, if you're just starting out, you should start with a small gun. That's just, that doesn't make much sense. Get like a gun.
And where I would go with this is, like I mentioned, that one of the things that the Smith did for people at our agency was like people with smaller hands had an easier time than with a lot of people that had Glocks, because a police issued Glock is not going to go get like the backstrap chopped down and the grip modified and a bunch of custom work done, right? So people with some people had a trigger reach issue with the Glocks that the Smith kind of solved. And that is something that you can factor into your decision making in terms of fitting the gun to the human that's going to use it, right? When it comes to concealed carry stuff, a small gun is going to be easier to carry and easier to conceal. And if your purpose is to carry it for concealment and comfort, then a small gun is great. They're also a lot harder to shoot. And unless you're going to use it a bunch, and especially if you're new and you're learning, you're going to have a steep learning curve. So you have to like account for that. So again, it's not that the advice is necessarily bad, like get a big gun, get a small gun, because I also don't think people should go and get a big gun to learn how to shoot and stop there, because if it's not what they're going to carry, then what difference does it make, right? In a perfect world, you would have more than one, right? But that's the context that matters.
Next, do I need a 45 or a 40? What about a 50 cal?
I think actually you should go, let's get something exotic. You got 357 SIG?
You know, there was a time when that really was the hotness. That was going to take over. Do you remember when Glock had their own caliber?
Oh.
It was like the 45 Glock.
Like the 8 Gap?
The Gap, yeah.
It was Gap, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Crazy. Yeah, caliber debates. I mean, look. I think there is a pretty solid consensus in the world right now about what caliber anyone should carry. But I'm here to tell you that, like, we could sit here and share it, and in 5 or 10 years, everyone's going to have a different opinion. So,
yep.
Like, make your own decisions, but understand that there are options and there are advantages and disadvantages. We're not going to settle all of that for you. And that's kind of the point of the episode, right?
Yeah.
Like, right now, 9mm seems to be the way, right? And we understand how and why that evolution occurred, right? There were problems with 9mm that led to the development of the 40. Those problems were corrected, and everyone kind of fell back to 9 in a big way, right? 380 is great for concealment. It's like a 9mm short. They don't tend to have as good of performance in terms of penetration depth as we would like, but there's some rounds out there now that are starting to look better and perform better. There's that new what's that new round that we did an interview on it, SHOT Show a couple years ago. It's like 30 super carry, something like that.
I don't know. There's always something different. The 5.7 was going to be the hotness for a little bit.
Something new that right now is exotic that maybe in a few years becomes mainstream. Who freaking knows, man? But like, if anyone, the key in that debate or that argument is if anyone is spouting to you that like they've got it all figured out, evaluate it carefully. There is a consensus right now, I think, for the most part, about calibers. But
yeah, my suggestion is get a major caliber, like 9, 40, 45, whatever, preferably 9.
Probably 9.
From a major manufacturer. Get the bullets from a major manufacturer. So if somebody's selling like some super bullet that like turns into a buzzsaw as it flies, wonderful. But guess what? Maybe just get one from Federal or Winchester,
not some just boutique
Spear or whatever, right? And preferably one that has some data behind it, right? One of the things I like about Federal bullets is they publish their data on their website. You can actually see what they say about their bullets, right? So thank goodness we got through the list. We have busted every myth in the gun community. There will be no more bullshit now on the internet because we solved it. Woo, okay.
We have epitomized the advice available.
Yeah. Whew.
Obviously, this little podcast of ours.
So the point really wasn't to list every myth ever or every piece of bad advice ever. We're not going to get there. We're not going to destroy every bad advice. But what I can do,
we're also not so arrogant to think that we like
have a monopoly
it all
on
figured
truth,
out better
right?
than everyone else.
Yeah.
Like that's the irony that I talked about in the beginning. Like I want to make sure we're clear about that.
Yeah, we don't claim a monopoly on truth, but what we do want you to do is be a critical consumer of information and help you sort through bullshit. So when you go take a concealed carry class, how do you know whether the person at the front of the room has their act together or not? That's important. That's maybe a life or death thing, depending on how the class is going. So how do you sort through the bullshit? First off, get more training. And just like we said, like, there's more to it than that. You need to get a mix of training. Hear from different instructors and different schools of thought. test your assumptions and question whether you're making an assumption or you have like a fantasy in your head, right? Do you have a idea in your head of like, it's only going to go a certain way, or the person giving you the advice, are they implying that the fight's only going to go a certain way? That's a clue. Okay. Pressure test whatever it is you're going to do. If you're going to carry a certain gun, go shoot that gun. If you're going to carry pepper spray, buy a couple of cans of that same can and spray one so you can see how far it goes, how many shots you have, how delicate, how sensitive it is to the wind. Yeah, learning will occur. It's good for you. Okay. Ask why when someone gives you advice. Say, well, why are you telling me that? And ask it like 5 times. You don't have to be annoying about it, but like try to get 3 layers deep as they're explaining whatever their logic is.
Yeah, I think especially when you're getting training and someone's giving you some explanation in class, and this is important, like you don't have to be a dick about this, but it's okay as a student. I think a lot of instructors will brush stuff off, right? They'll just be like, "Oh, it's 9mm. Like just trust me on this." Like, don't be afraid to be like, "Yeah, but how did you come to that conclusion?"
Yeah, right.
Don't be afraid to press them a little bit. And you're just being a good student, right?
Yeah.
And a good instructor like a Mike or a Jim is like, we love the opportunity to nerd out on something like that, right? A good instructor will entertain it.
And you learn a lot about your instructor if you ask them, and whether they take that as like a knock on their ego, or whether they take that as a, hey, I'm glad you asked. Here's why. Here's the data. Here's the research. Here's the vignette that we're basing that off of, right?
Yeah, especially if they're only giving an anecdote or a story versus and I can point you to some research, or I can point you to an article, or something like I can get you more information, or if they're bullshitting you, it'll come out.
Yep. Next is learn the rules. Like literally Google the rules. Google the law in your state. I can't believe how many people have told me pepper spray is illegal in a state where it is sold in Target down the street. Learn the rules. If you say it's illegal, why? Right? Is it illegal to carry? Is it illegal to use? Is it illegal to own? Really? Because it's sold in the gas station and the sporting goods store and the Target and the Walmart. So it's probably not that illegal.
I really liked the lesson about like bear spray is actually weaker than pepper spray. Like that's the kind of stuff that like people think bigger is better. And it's like, oh, wow, actually. And like that was a funny rules thing to learn about.
Yeah.
It turns out as a society, we're a lot cooler with hurting each other than fucking with nature.
Just it's inspiring. When you are considering someone's resume, someone says, I was a member of Omega Force or the Rangers or the SEALs, whatever. Cool. Really ask yourself the question, like, do they have training? Do they have any training? Do they have recent training? Okay, you were a SEAL in Vietnam. Okay, that's cool. Things have changed since then. And we keep mentioning the SEALs. This is not about the SEALs. But in the social media environment, in the modern media environment, like it comes up a lot. That's why we're using that.
The same could be true for SWAT guys or special forces. Or
I was a cop for 30 years. Okay, well, what kind of cop? Well, I did investigations. Okay, how many fights were you in? Right? Is their training relevant to you? Okay, you were Army Ranger. What about being an Army Ranger is relevant to me walking through a parking lot? Okay, some parts will overlap. There are good lessons to learn from them. There are good lessons to learn about fitness and conditioning.
As an Army Ranger, were you ever in a situation you had to carry concealed?
Yeah.
The answers might surprise you. I will tell you, a lot of civilian instructors that like to throw a lot of shade at a lot of military guys will say stuff like that and not actually know that there's actually a surprising number of circumstances that some military dudes might find themselves in plain clothes carrying concealed in places where they damn well better not be carrying a gun, right?
Yeah.
Or get caught carrying a gun.
If someone is talking shit about military guys or military service, that should also stand out, right? Oh, you were an Air Force guy. Well, let me tell you, not all Air Force guys are the same. Not all Army guys are the same. Some military training is really, really, really good. Some military training is lowest common denominator. So the mere fact that someone had a military background doesn't tell you a whole lot, or that they were in the Coast Guard. Well, right now, the Coast Guard's doing some really badass tactical work.
Dude.
Like legit badass.
Yeah.
Mike and I talk about this a lot with the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol has one of the most proficient SWAT organizations in the country right now.
Yeah, BORTAC. Those guys are studs.
So, don't get too into the agency stuff, especially if you weren't in it or among it. Like, don't make big assumptions about it based on things you saw on the internet, right? Oh, the Air Force guy. Well, let me tell you about the Air Force guys. Some of them are actually pretty darn badass. And not necessarily the ones you would expect.
Looking at you, Jim.
Yeah, not me. I'm a cream puff. But that's neither here nor there. Next thing I want you to consider is know yourself. What is your level of training and experience? Maybe you might know more than the person giving you the advice. Okay? Or a lot less. Sometimes you need to shut up and color and just hit the I believe button a little bit, right? What is your fitness? Your personal conditioning is going to make a huge difference. One, in your survival as a human, and also in your ability to survive a fight, or your ability to carry a big gun. This is one of my favorite things about dealing with SEALs and Rangers and stuff, is those are typically big, strong dudes. And, carrying a 10-pound rifle is hard for them, but they can do it. They've got the build for it. They've got the pectoral muscles for it and stuff. Not everyone I see at a gun show, not everyone I see at SHOT Show can carry a 10-pound rifle. That might not sound like much. Let me tell you how heavy a 10-pound rifle gets on mile 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, right? Consider what risks are you facing? What scenarios are you facing? Are you going to have to carry a 10-pound rifle for 5 miles? Probably not. Even in law enforcement. Mike, what's the farthest you've ever had to walk in kit? On an operational thing for SWAT?
Several miles.
Okay.
I mean, we do large scale canine searches. Someone that shot at the cops, ran into the neighborhood. I mean, we have there's actually a saying on my team that on high risk area searches, and I do both, right? SWAT and canine. Mm-hmm. But on the high risk ones, we'll go out with the dog, and then we have a bunch of SWAT guys come with us for cover. And we have a saying that this is why SWAT school's hard.
I like that.
It's those high risk area searches where we will be out there in kit for hours, and we'll cover several miles. And in kit in the summer in Arizona, let me tell you, it sucks balls.
Yeah.
But that is probably not the typical experience.
As a concealed carrier, I have never had to walk around in kit.
Unless you're LARPing or something.
At work, doing military stuff, I've had to do a lot of that. But when I'm just walking across the parking lot, I'm just walking across the parking lot, right? So know yourself, know your training, know what you're really worried about, and tailor your work around that, right? And do your worries match your actual risks? Next thing I want you to do is watch for red flags. And we've been trying to highlight those as we go. But notice fantasy. Notice when the person offering you advice is only thinking about one scenario going one way. Notice box checking. That's a recurring theme through this whole episode, right? Just kick the guy in the balls. Just gouge his eyes out. Just get a shotgun. Just get a Glock. Is the person offering you advice just trying to mentally check a box? There's something to be said for simplifying, a way ahead for a student, but you don't just respond with "it depends." But you got to layer, right? If someone tells you just get a shotgun or just keep a big can of bear spray by your bed, they're not helping you. I also want you to consider red flags. If someone is telling you to outsmart the engineers or the major manufacturers, that's a red flag. If you're a beginner, stick with the stock gun. You don't need to do all the tweaks until you really feel like you know. Like, don't take down a fence until you know why the fence is put there.
And it should be a solution to a particular challenge.
Yeah. Next is absolutes. Only Siths see the world in absolutes, right? So like, Glocks are garbage, or Glocks are not garbage, or leather holsters are garbage, or they're not garbage. Like, the world's just not that simple. There's a time and a place for a lot of things.
My big takeaways on this, I mentioned earlier how you have to have those opposing ideas in your head, and you've got to be able to maintain some internal consistency, right? There are lots of choices that I have made along the way about concealed carry, about work stuff, about home security and defense, and I think I have a pretty good frame of reference, context, perspective, experience, all the things, critical thinking, good judgment, whatever I bring to bear when I make those choices and I go the direction that I have chosen to go. But I would like to think, and I certainly hope, that I have made those choices and gone that direction with a fair appreciation for the shortcomings and the downsides and all the cons for every pro that I've identified, right? All the trade-offs. And you've got to be able to constantly kind of go back and forth. And Jim mentioned looking out for some of those like red flags. And I think one of the big ones that you have to be careful about is finding reasons, right? It's a confirmation bias where you see some little shred of evidence to validate something that you already hoped or believed to be true, right? Oh, see, I told you Glock sucks because it had a malfunction on a range. Of all the millions of Glocks out there, like, it had a malfunction today, and therefore all Glock sucks. See, I told you Glock sucks. Like, okay. They're also like one of the largest produced handguns in the world. They're going to have issues, right? Go out and shoot it enough to find out for yourself. Don't just take one little shred of evidence just to confirm something that you already believe to be true. Where that takes us is watch out for any situation where advice or input is being oversimplified. Be inquisitive and open-minded. If you ever watch the show Ted Lasso, one of my favorite quotes from the Ted Lasso, be curious, not judgmental. And I really like that quote as it relates specifically to tactics, because I see people in the tactical community, man, their egos. And I'm guilty of this. I'm sure Jim's guilty of this. We're all guilty. We all have an ego for sure, right?
No, I have the best.
I forgot
ego.
Jim's a pilot. So.
I'm a pilot.
Oh, yeah.
In case we didn't tell you yet, I am a pilot.
Right. Be curious, not judgmental. And it kind of goes that there's a quote, listen to understand, not to respond. Right. And I think a lot of people, when someone tells them, oh, this is how we do business, or this is how we clear a room, and this is how we treat a casualty, and this is how we, right? People usually are listening to that sort of stuff to be critical of it in a sense of like, well, this is how we do it because we're right. Instead of understanding why they do it the way they do it, right? Be curious, not judgmental. Don't jump to conclusions. Ask better questions. Challenge assumptions. I mentioned earlier that quote that John Boyd talked about challenging assumptions, and what he said was you got to challenge all assumptions, because if you don't, what is doctrine on day one becomes dogma forever after. And man, what a better example to illustrate that than the 9mm versus 40 cal debate, right? We've seen the pendulum swing on that. That's going to happen again in the future. Constantly challenge your assumptions. And all of the advice that you give or receive or otherwise should always be, in my opinion, this is my advice to you, should always be framed through the lens of people, ideas, and hardware in that order. What are the human factors at play? What are the tactics and the context and the techniques that this is going to be applied in? And how does the hardware enhance the solution to whatever problem, right? Through those lenses. I think that's important. So I think that is all I got. Again, we are sensitive to the fact that we are giving advice about bad advice and telling you don't listen to people. So by all means, let us know where we're fucking this up. The last thing that I'll say is I mentioned earlier that one of the most valuable things that happens in some of the conversations that I've been in are the very passionate, heated debates that happen in the rooms that I am privileged enough, and I do consider it a privilege to be in those rooms and among some of those people. We don't always agree on things. Like, quite often we disagree on stuff, but that is the magic. That's where the magic happens. I'm telling you right now, that's where innovation occurs, right? And that's what turns the needle. So embrace that. Don't shy away from it. That's all I got, Jim.
Have a good one. Be safe out there. Be smart out there. Be careful when you're giving other people advice. Make sure you're part of the solution on that, not part of the problem. And if someone gives you questionable advice, question it. That's a good thing. That's how we get the good, positive debates, and we figure out like what the smart answer really is. And be willing to change. Good advice 20 years ago is not good advice now. All right. Toodles.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. This episode is also brought to you by 09 Holsters. We talk a lot about people, ideas, and hardware on this show, so when we invest in equipment, we always think in terms of experience first. 09 is helping you figure out how to carry the gear you need to be effective. They are built by cops, for cops, with a minimalist design and bomb-proof durability. Radio cases, flashlights, body cameras, even canine remotes, you name it, 09 has been filling a void in tactical duty holsters for more than a decade. Go see what they offer at 09 Holsters, that's ZERO, the number 9, holsters.com. 09, built to win the fight. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.